Now we're starting the C'iroבין, Parak Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. We're going to do our best to try to explain things as clear as possible. This is audio, so we hope you'll be able to get the pictures properly. We'll try to make things as simple as we can. The Mishnah starts off, if the cross beam of an alley is more than 20 amas above the ground. So what are we talking about over here? What's a mavoi? So in the times of the Mishnayos, houses and streets were arranged in the following manner. You had several houses standing in a common courtyard, which was a chutzner, and several such courtyards, several chatzeres opened into an alley. This alley is called a mavoi, through which the residents of the courtyard walked out to the main street. The main street would be a Rishus HaRabim. The streets are Rishus HaRabim, but the alley, the mavoi, if it's enclosed on three sides, is Rishus HaYochid. The Chacham were concerned that people might view the alley, the mavoi, as Rishus HaRabim, since it's used as a street and it's completely open on one side. If carrying was permitted in the mavoi, people might come to carry in a real Rishus HaRabim as well, which would be an Isur Deraisa. So to prevent this, the Chachamim asked carrying in the mavoi. As is the case with Rishus HaRabim, it's also to carry 4 amas in the mavoi from Rishus Yochid into the alley, and vice versa. Of course, it's also to carry from the alley into the main street, and vice versa, because the alley is Rishus Yochid according to the Torah, and the street is going to be Rishus HaRabim. That fact doesn't change at all. The Chachamim added, though, that if a certain adjustment is made to the entrance of the mavoi, carrying it is mutter. It's also necessary for the residents, for the people who live in the chatzeros, to make a shetufei mavoyos to allow carrying in the mavoi, and an iruvei chatzeros to allow carrying in the chatzeros, as we explained in the introduction. This adjustment can take the form of a koira, placed above the entrance, or a pole, a lechi, placed at the side of the entrance. Most of this parak refers to this mavoi enclosed on 3 sides and open to the street on the 4th side, in which carrying is usur unless a lechi or a kaira is placed at the open side. The first Mishnah begins by mentioning a machlekes as to whether the kaira must be placed within a certain height from the ground. So mavoi shu gavoy l'mayla me'esrim ama yamayit. If the cross beam of the alley of the mavoi is higher than 20 amas above the ground, one must lower it. Why? It may not be higher than 20 amas because it's meant to serve as a sign indicating that the alley is not a Rishus HaRabim, and a sign that's more than 20 amas high above the ground is ineffective because people will not notice there it's too high up. The Gemara says it's too high. It must therefore be lowered to a height of 20 amas or less, where it will then be noticed. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not necessary to lower the kaira. According to Yehuda, the kaira is not a sign which must be noticeable, but a mechitza that closes off the open side of the mavoi. The sides of the beam of the kaira are viewed as though they extend towards the ground, forming a complete wall. This is the halachic principle known as pituk yered zesaisim, as we mentioned in the Hakdama. So for this purpose, it's effective even if it's higher than 20 amas. So obviously we know the Gemara's kasha, the Gemara at the beginning of C'iroבין, and the Gemara at the beginning of Sukkah, because the first Mishnah in Sukkah says Sukkah shigavoy l'malam esrim ama psula, and over here the Mishnah says yamait. So what's pshat over there? It says and by Sukkah it's no good, and over here it's yamait. Says the Gemara gives different terutzim, but the pashtus is that Sukkah is the raisa, so it says pasal, and mavoi is the rabbanon, so it says yamait. So it gives a chanetza, but by the raisa we want to let you know the ikra halacha. If the alley's opening is wider than 10 amas, so one must make it narrower. For example, by placing boards at the sides of the entrance until it's 10 amas wide or less. An opening that's more than 10 amas is too wide to be considered a halachic pesach. Rather, it's just a breach in the alley surrounding walls because entrances are usually not wider than 10 amas. As such, it cannot be fixed with a kaira or a lechi because those adjustments are valid only for an entrance. However, if the alley's open side has the form of a doorway, there's a post at each side of the opening and a bar that extends from the top of one of the posts to the top of the other, forming the shape of a doorway, like a ches, and has 2 doorposts and a lintel. Even if the opening is wider than 10 amas, one does not need to make it narrower because the form of a doorway, the Tzuras HaPesach, is considered a Pesach no matter how wide it is. Once the opening of the alley has the form of a doorway, Tzuras HaPesach carrying in the alley is mutter without an additional kaira or lechi. The cross beam mentioned earlier in this Mishnah does not suffice on its own as a Tzuras HaPesach because it's not positioned above 2 poles, rather it's supported by the 2 walls that flank the alley's entrance, So you need to make three. You need to put up three pieces. You need to put up one on each side and one running across the top that attaches the two, and that would be considered a Suras HaPesach. Fine. Mishnah Beis. Hechsher Mavoi. This is the remedy that's required for a Mavoi to make, carrying motor there. Beishamai Ermim Lechi B'Kaira. Beishamai say you need to have a pole and a crossbeam over the entrance in order to make it able to carry in it. Beis Hillel Ermim Lechi Oikaira, either a pole or a crossbeam is enough. Rabbi Lezer says L'chayayim. Beishamai require two poles, one at either side of the entrance. Rabbi Lezer agrees with Beishamai, but he heard a different version of what Beishamai said. The Mishnah presented this agreement. The Mishnah is going to bring a machlekes as to whether the machlekes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is limited to a particular situation or it's a general halacha. Mishum Rabbi Shmuel Omar Talmud Echad L'fnei Rabbi Kiva. A student, a Talmud, said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel before Rabbi Kiva. The Rav says that this Talmud is Reb Meir. Reb Meir said b'shem Rabbi Shmuel to Rabbi Kiva that Leinechleku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel Al Mavish Upachas Me'arba Ames Shehu Niter Obi Lechi Obi Kaira Alma Nechleku Arochel Me'arba Ames Ve'ad Eser. Let's take this slow and break this down. Try to simplify it. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel do not disagree on Mavish Upachas Me'arba Ames regarding a Mavi that's less than 4 Ames wide. Shehu Niter Obi Lechi Obi Kaira, because there it can be mutter to carrying it with either a lechi or a kaira. Even Beis Shammai accept that in such a narrow alley, either adjustment is noticeable on its own. Alma nechleku. What then do they disagree about? Arachim arba ames vad eser. They disagreed regarding an alley that's between 4 ames and 10 ames wide. An alley, a mavoi, whose entrance is wider than 10 ames, cannot be rectified with a lechi or a kaira. Rather, Shus HaPesach is required, as we learned in the previous Mishnah. Since the entrance is relatively wide, both a lechi and a kaira are necessary. Even in this case, either a pole or a crossbeam is good enough. However, Rabbi Kiva did not accept this limitation of the machlekes. Rabbi Kiva. So Rabbi Kiva said regarding this machlekes, al-zev al-zen nechleku. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed regarding both, whether the mavoi is narrower than Daled Ames, and whether the mavoi is wider than 4 ames, but less than 10 ames wide, with Beis Shammai requiring the lechi and the kaira even at the entrance of a mavoi that would be 4 ames or less wide. Mishnah Gimel, HaKaira she'amru, this kaira that we're talking about in the Mishnah, Rechava k'dei lekabel ariach, must be wide enough to hold the type of brick called an ariach. A riach is half as wide as a levena, which is a brick that's 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim long. 3 tvachim wide by 3 tvachim long. So an ariach is a brick 1.5 tvachim wide by 3 tvachim long. However, the kaira itself does not need to be a full 1.5 tvachim wide. Rather, it's enough for the kaira to be 1 tefach wide, so that it can hold an ariach lengthwise, that is the length of the ariach, lying along the length of the beam and overlapping it a little on each side. 1 tefach of the ariach's width sits directly on the beam, and a 1/4 tefach of the ariach's width extends past each side of the beam. Once the beam is a tefach wide, the 1/4 tefach of the ariach that sticks out from each side can be supported with cement. If the kaira is wide enough to support an ariach, a structure of some permanence can be built on top of it. So that's considered a davar chashuv, I guess. And that's how the Gemara explains it. That's why it's going to be good enough to change the status of the rishos. Mishnah Dalet. Rechava kedei lekabel ariach. The kaira must be wide enough to support an ariach. Ubrio kedei lekabel ariach. Also strong enough to support an ariach. Meaning, if you have it wide enough, meaning the size, but it's very thin and won't be able to hold, so then it's not going to be good. According to Yerushalmi, the kaira must be strong enough to support a row of bricks along its entire length. So it's not just kedei lekabel one ariach, but kedei lekabel one row of ariach. So to change the status of the mavoi, the kaira must be capable of supporting a permanent structure, and for that purpose, width alone does not suffice. I mean, it's not good enough if it's that sheer of width. Rather, the beam must also have the necessary strength. If the crossbeam is wide enough to support an ariach, it's effective, it's good, even if it's not strong enough to support one. As we learned in Mishnah Aleph, Rabbi Yehuda holds that the beam serves as a mechitza that closes off the entrance. To be a mechitza, it only needs to have the correct shiurim, and it doesn't matter how strong it is. Now, there are nafkamina sometimes how strong it is, because let's say you have let's say in Lagabe Hilchasukkah, that you know it's Ein Yachalame B'Ruach Metzuya. if it's going to get blown down by even a regular wind, so then that's going to be a problem. So the brios, the strength of the mechitza has an afkamina, but I think the pshat is that Kipshuta we're understanding that a regular mechitza is going to stand, not that it's going to fall down Baruch Shana Metzuya, but there is such a thing. Mishnah Hey, Hoysa Shal Kasha Shal Kanim. Rabbi Yehuda is going to illustrate his opinion that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, that the kaira doesn't need to be strong enough to support an ariach. So if the kaira was made out of straw, it reads, Hoysa Shal Kasha Shal Kanim, Rei Nasa Kilu Shal Matris. We view it as if it was made out of metal, because metal can support an ariach. Akuma Rei Nasa Kilu Pshuta. Similarly, if the kaira is bent in a way that the ariach would fall off of it, we view it as though we're straight. Agula Rain Oisa Kiluhi Merubas. If you have a pole that's round and the ariach won't be able to actually sit on it, but even if it would be strong enough, but if you put the ariach on it, it would roll off, we look at it as if it were square with a flat surface. In order for any beam to be effective, its width must be at least one tefach. So the Mishnah explains how to make the cheshbon of the diameter of the round beam based on the circumference. So this is the idea of pi, as we know. Anything that has a circumference of 3 tefach has a diameter of 1 tefach. Thus, the circumference of a round beam must be at least 3 tefachim, so that its width, the diameter, will meet the required minimum. In fact, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is somewhat more than 3. It's closer to 3 1/7. However, the exact number, known by the Greek letter pi, is impossible to calculate with absolute accuracy, since the number can only be approximated in any event. The Chacham and Paskin that it should be rounded down to 3 with respect to any halachic issues. Mishnah Vav. The poles of which the Chachamim spoke, meaning that where Rebbe Lezer held, in Mishnah Beis, Rebbe Lezer held you need to have 2 poles, and Beis Hillel say that 1 pole is good enough. Gavan Asar Tvachim, they need to be at least 10 Tvachim high. Berachban Vavin Kol Shehu, the width and the thickness can be anything. There's no shear for how wide or thick they have to be. Since the walls of the mova must be at least 10 tefachim high, the poles must have that height as well, but there's no minimum shear for the width or thickness. Rabbi Yossi Aimer, however, Rabbi Yossi says, the width must be at least 3 tefachim, because otherwise it would not be significant. According to Rabbi Yossi, the pole is meant to signify a partition that runs across the entrance of the alley. It cannot serve this purpose unless it's at least 3 tefachim wide. Mishnah Zayin. Vakal Oisen L'chayayim. You may make a poles out of anything. Even a living creature, which is an animal that's at least 10 tefachim tall, that's tied to the side of the alley, would have the same effect as the pole. Now, obviously, the animal has to be tied up so it doesn't run away. In addition, it must be tied to prevent it from bending down or crouching or lowering its height to less than 10 tefachim, for a concern that if it would run away or crouch down, people might not notice it and will continue to carry, even though the carrying has become asur. Rabbi Yossi forbids using a living creature as a pole because it might die and become shorter than 10 tefachim. The Mishnah discusses the use of a living creature in 2 other areas of halacha. The first is the cover of a grave, which is a goylel, which is tameh, can transmit tumah. A goylel is a large stone or similar object that covers a grave and seals the top. The Chachamim learn from a pasuk that a goylel is the primary source of tumah, similar to the mace itself. So someone who touches it becomes tameh for at least 7 days, and it retains this status even after being removed from the grave. The living creature transmits tumah if it was used as the cover of a grave. Although living creatures other than humans are generally unable to become tameh, an animal used for a goylel is an exception to the rule. For a meir mitahar, however, a meir says that its tahar cannot become tameh and certainly does not transmit any tumah. A meir holds that any mechitza formed by a living creature is not halachically valid because the life force that holds it up is not tangible. And this halacha applies to other partition-like structures, including a goylel. Because in a love gitin nashim, you may write a get on a living creature. Basically holds that such a get is no good. Why? The Torah describes a get as a sefer, which Rabbi Glili understands is referring to a document written on parchment. He interprets the verse as excluding a get being memayit, the get that's written on a balchai, as is discussed in Sech Gittin. Mishnah Ches, Sheyara Shachanse Babika. If a caravan or a group of travelers camped in an open plain before Shabbos, it's not Rosh Hashanah, it's not Rosh Hashanah, and it has the status of a carmelist, which would be also to carry only midrabanan. So the Mishnah will teach us how to convert such an area into Rosh Hashanah by erecting a fence around it. And they surrounded their camp with animal gear like saddles and blankets, creating a makeshift fence in which there are many gaps. One may carry in the camp, even if the fence was put up for only a short time. It's still a valid mechitza. As long as the fence is at least 10 tvachim high. 10 tvachim is the shortest amount for any halachic mechitza. And the total width of all the gaps has to be not more than the total width of all the solid parts. But if the total width of the gaps is more than the total width of the solid parts, the mechitza is no good. Each part of the mechitza of the enclosure is viewed independently. If one side is mostly open, that side is no good, even if the others are entirely closed. This affects an enclosure that has only the minimum of 3 sides. If just one of them is mostly open, the entire enclosure is no good because it only has 2 valid sides. You need to have at least 3. You need to have mechitza on at least 3 sides. Kol pirza shehika eser amas muteras. This halacha applies where the gaps are not too wide. A gap that's very wide can disqualify the mechitza, even if it's the only gap and the rest of the partition is solid. So kol pirza shehika eser amas muteras. Any gap that's 10 amas wide or less is mutter, and would not disqualify the rest of the mechitza because it's considered like an entrance that was built into the wall, rather than the wall being breached to destroy the wall. Yes, and we can also, however, a gap that's more than 10 amos wide is usher. It disqualifies any mechitza, even one that's mostly solid, because it's too wide to be viewed as an entrance and is regarded as a breach instead. Because an entrance is usually not more than 10 amos wide, therefore, as long as the gap is 10 amos wide or less, it can be viewed as an entrance that provides access to the enclosed area. Since an entrance is a necessary part of the wall, the mechitza is regarded as though it continues across the gap, thereby closing it up. Mishnah Tes. Makifin shloisha chavolim zel l'mayla mizeh v'zel l'mayla mizeh v'avad shlo yehei ben chevel l'chaverei shloisha tvachim. There's another eitzah to surround the camp with 3 horizontal ropes attached to posts driven into the ground, one rope above the other, and zel l'mayla mizeh, one rope on top of the other. V'avad shlo yehei ben chevel l'chaverei shloisha tvachim, as long as there's no gap of 3 tvachim or more between one rope and the next, or between the bottom rope and the ground. So if the highest rope must be within 3 tvachim of the middle rope, and the middle rope must be within 3 tvachim of the lowest rope, and the lowest rope must be within 3 tvachim of the ground. Such a partition is considered to be entirely solid because a gap of less than 3 tvachim between 2 objects is considered lavud, which is a halacha that says that a gap of less than 3 tvachim is not regarded as a gap at all, but is considered to be filled in. For this reason, even a fence that's almost entirely open is a good mechitza if the gaps are narrower than 3 tvachim. When the previous Mishnah disqualified a mechitza in which the gaps exceed the solid parts, it was referring to gaps that are 3 tvachim wide or more. The thickness of all 3 ropes together must be more than a tefach. So that the total height of the fence is at least 10 tvachim, which is the minimum height of a mechitza. As we mentioned before, the gaps between the adjacent ropes and the gaps between the lowest rope and the ground must be less than 3 tvachim, making a total of a bit less than 9 tvachim. Therefore, the combined thickness of all the ropes must be a bit more than 1 tefach in order to give the partition a total height of 10 tvachim, meaning that the rope itself meaning the ropes themselves is not just to make a mechitza, but the actual physical rope is going to be a chelak added to the mechitza. Mishnah Yud, Makivim Bekanim, or you may alternatively surround the camp with vertical posts driven into the ground without any horizontal ropes, as long as there's no gap of 3 tvachim between one post and the next. If all the posts are within 3 tvachim of each other, the mechitza is valid, even if it's almost entirely open, because the space is narrower than 3 tvachim and not halachically viewed. For example, if you have the big traffic cones, not the small ones, but you have the big ones, let's say it would be 10 tvachim high, you can set them up around your area in a place that's a carmelist, and then create yourself a Rosh Hashanah. So the mechitza mentioned in the previous Mishnah, the ropes, and the one mentioned here, the posts, the kanim, are not as good as regular mechitzas. So b'shiyara diru, when the chachamim were matter these mechitzas, they spoke only of a shiyara, which is a caravan. It's a group of at least 3 people traveling together may use such mechitzas, but 1 or 2 people may not. The Reb Yehuda. It says like Reb Yehuda, since a group of 3 people require more space than 1 or 2, the mechitzas must be longer, so Reb Yehuda allows them to use shvacher mechitzas, which are easier to erect. They mention a caravan because that's the most common circumstance. In fact, even a lone traveler may use these shvacher mechitzas. The Chachamim mentioned a caravan of 3 travelers only because they're more likely to put up a mechitza of this type. But it's not stam in the Welterrein that you could put up shvacher mechitzas and then say, oh, I'm going to carry here. It only works if people are traveling. Since it's difficult for travelers to build regular mechitzas when camping in a desolate area, they may rely on shvacher mechitzas. People who are staying in an inhabited area must construct regular mechitzas. Kol mechitza she'ena shel shasiv shel erev ena mechitza. Any mechitza that does not have both vertical and horizontal parts is not a good mechitza unless a partition consists of both shesi and erev, vertical and horizontal elements such as ropes. I mean, you need to have posts and ropes. It would be no good even for a caravan. To Rabbi Yesi, Rabbi Yehuda. As I said, Rabbi Yesi, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yesi, Rabbi Yehuda is more machmir than Rabbi Yehuda himself. Rabbi Yehuda was matir these shvachim mechitzas for a shiyara. Rabbi Yesi forbids it in all cases. The Chacham say either one of these 2 things is good enough. That is, it may have either vertical or horizontal parts, and there's no need to have both of them. The Chachamim were matir the use of the inferior mechitzas for anyone, even for a person who's not traveling. I mean, this would be fakert from the Loiderbruk Bashiyara El Bahoiva, but there's a different sheet to the Chacham here also. Get to the 4 sheetas in this Mishnah, and we're going to mention them in the order of the Chumrah Shabbai. The second group of the Chacham hold that the inferior mechitzas are completely good in all circumstances. The first group of the Chachamim that's mentioned in the first part of the Mishnah are matir only for people traveling. Rabbi Yehuda limits their use to a caravan of at least 3 people, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that they may not be used at all. Arba dvarim pater b'machna. The Chachamim pater people who are traveling and are camping out during a war 4 things. They can bring wood from anywhere. It's not considered gzela. Even after the owner cut it down and made it into bundles, he's allowed to take that. They don't have to wash their hands before eating bread, and they don't have to eat. They don't have to take off ma'aser from the mai, and they don't have to make an eruv to allow carrying from one tent to another. If several houses open into a common courtyard, you need to make eruv chatzeres. But over here, in technically speaking, for the army, you would have to make a Ruvi Chatzeres. But over here, the Chacham were Mekel, and they pat to you that you do not have to do that when you're in a Mulchama. Ad kan.